There's a certain kind of person you've probably met at least once in your life. They don't panic when their phone dies. They sit with silence like it's an old friend. They'll fix something broken 10 times before they even think about replacing it. And when things get hard, they don't fall apart. They just get quieter and they get to work. These are the people who grew up in the 1960s. And if you think their generation was just about bell-bottoms and rock music, you've been looking at the wrong picture, because underneath all of that, something happened to those kids. Something got carved into them so deeply that decades later, it still shapes how they love, how they fear, how they trust, and how they see a world that has changed almost beyond recognition. And today, we're going to talk about what that really looks like. Not the history lesson version, the human version. Let's start with something most people don't think about. The 1960s wasn't one decade. It was about 5 different worlds packed into 10 years. You had the early 60s, which still felt like the 50s. Quiet streets, Sunday dinners, fathers in suits, mothers in aprons. A kind of stillness that seems almost impossible to imagine now. And then, without warning, everything cracked open. Assassinations, Vietnam, civil rights marches, the moon landing, protests on college campuses. The world these kids grew up in didn't just change. It shattered, reformed, and shattered again. And they watched all of it before they were even old enough to vote now. Here's the thing about growing up inside chaos. It doesn't make you fragile. It makes you a particular kind of strong that people today often mistake for coldness. People who grew up in the 60s learned early that the world doesn't pause because you're scared. The news didn't get softer because a child was watching. And that shaped them. Not in a broken way. In a built-to-last way. Think about the children who watched their fathers come home from war, or not come home at all. Think about the kids who sat in front of a black and white television and watched a president get shot. Think about the teenagers who marched in the streets because they genuinely believed that if they didn't, nothing would ever change. These weren't passive experiences. They were defining ones. And the people who lived through them carry something that can't be downloaded or explained in a podcast. They carry the weight of having actually seen what the world is capable of, both the worst and the most beautiful. And what does that do to a person's psychology? The first thing it does is make them deeply, almost uncomfortably practical. People who grew up in the 60s tend to have this radar for what actually matters. They don't spend energy on things they can't control. They're not interested in symbolic gestures that don't produce real results. If something is broken, they want to know how to fix it, not how to talk about how broken it is. That might make them seem dismissive to younger generations. But it's not dismissal. It's decades of watching what survives and what doesn't. They also have a complicated relationship with trust. And this is one of the most important things to understand if you love someone from this generation. The 60s taught people that institutions lie. Governments lie. Authority figures, the ones you were supposed to believe in, they lie too. These people watch that happen in real time. And when you learn that lesson young, it goes somewhere very deep. It doesn't make you cynical in a hopeless way. It makes you careful. It makes you someone who watches and waits before you fully believe. And it makes you incredibly loyal when you do finally decide to trust. Because when people who grew up in the 60s give you their trust, they've already thought about it for a long time. Now let's talk about something that doesn't get said enough. The 60s generation knew how to feel things without talking about them constantly. They didn't have the language of therapy the way we do now. Nobody sat them down and asked them to name their emotions or process their trauma in a safe space. They just lived with their feelings the way you live with weather. You didn't complain about rain. You put on a coat and you kept walking. And while the world has gained a lot from learning to talk about mental health, something also got lost. There was a kind of dignity in that older way of carrying yourself. A refusal to let your pain become your identity. But here's where it gets complicated. Because that same quality, that ability to push feelings down and keep going, it also meant that a lot of people in this generation never healed from things they needed to heal from. The trauma just got packed away in a box somewhere deep inside, and it showed up later in the form of distant parenting, or an inability to apologize, or a fierce avoidance of anything that felt too emotionally naked. It's not that they didn't feel, it's that they were taught in 1,000 quiet ways that feeling too much was a kind of weakness. And that lesson stuck. One of the most fascinating things about people who grew up in the 60s is their relationship with work. These are people who understood from a very young age that effort was not optional. It was the only currency that counted. They watched their parents work themselves to the bone for things that seem almost modest by today's standards. A house, a steady paycheck, a family that ate dinner together, and they absorbed that value completely. Which is why, even now, many of them struggle to rest. Truly rest. Not because they're workaholics in the modern hustle culture sense, but because somewhere inside them, stillness still feels like falling behind. And yet, at the same time, this generation had something that work culture today rarely produces. A sense of craft. A patience with the slow build. They grew up in a time when you learned how to do things properly, not quickly. A well-made thing was worth making well. A skill worth having was worth practicing for years. There was no shortcut worship, and that gave them a relationship with quality that a lot of younger people genuinely envy, even if they can't quite name what they're envying. Let's talk about community. Because this is one of the deepest differences between people who grew up in the 60s and almost everyone who came after. In those years, neighborhoods were real in a way that's hard to explain to someone who grew up with the internet. Your neighbors knew your name. They knew your parents. They watched you grow up, and they felt responsible for you in some basic human way. You didn't lock your door because the whole street was, in some sense, your extended family. And when something went wrong, people showed up. Not with a GoFundMe, with a casserole dish and a willingness to stay. That kind of belonging shaped people in a way that I think leaves a mark that lasts a lifetime. People who grew up with real physical community often carry an expectation of loyalty and presence that the modern world consistently fails to deliver. And that gap between what they learn to expect and what the world actually provides now, that's a source of genuine grief for a lot of people in this generation, even if they'd never used that word. Now, let's talk about the music. Because the music of the 60s wasn't background noise. It was oxygen. It was a whole generation speaking a language to each other that the adults couldn't fully decode. The Beatles, Motown, Bob Dylan, Jimi Hendrix, Aretha Franklin. This wasn't just entertainment. It was a shared emotional experience on a massive scale. Songs carried ideas. Songs carried protest. Songs carried grief and hope and rebellion all at once. And the people who grew up with that music never lost the relationship they have with it. Put on the right song from that era in front of someone who grew up then, and watch what happens to their face. Watch where they go. The music is a doorway back to something they felt when they were young. Something they still believe in, even if life has made it harder to hold on to. And speaking of belief, there's something important here. The 60s generation, the ones who came of age in that decade, they believed they could change the world. Not as a motivational poster sentiment, as a genuine, serious conviction. They marched for civil rights not knowing if it would work. They protested a war at the risk of their futures. They imagined a different world, and they threw their bodies at the gap between what existed and what they thought should exist. That's not something you forget. Even if the world didn't change as completely as they hoped. Even if they grew up and had mortgages and the fire got smaller. The belief is still there, somewhere underneath everything. The knowledge that they once tried to remake something as enormous as reality itself. And that belief, or the partial loss of it, is one of the most private griefs a lot of people from this generation carry. Because the 60s didn't deliver everything it promised. The revolution wasn't complete. Things got better in some ways and stayed the same or got worse in others. And the people who gave everything to that hope had to figure out what to do when the wave broke and receded. How do you build a quiet life after you believed in something that loud? That's a question a lot of people in this generation answered differently. Some retreated. Some transformed their idealism into smaller, more personal forms of change. Some never quite forgave the world for not becoming what they were sure it could be. Now I want to talk about something that tends to get misread. People who grew up in the 60s are often described as tough. And they are. But the toughness has a texture that I think gets misunderstood. It's not the brittle, aggressive toughness of someone who's never been hurt. It's the quiet, patient toughness of someone who has been through enough that they know they can survive most things. It shows up in small ways. They don't complain about discomfort the way people do now. They don't expect the world to adjust itself to their needs. They're more likely to adjust themselves. And while that can sometimes look like an unwillingness to advocate for themselves, it actually comes from somewhere much deeper. From the belief that you are responsible for your own life, that nobody is coming to save you, and that the work of becoming a person is something you do by doing, not by waiting. There's also something profoundly generous about this generation that often gets overlooked. These are people who show love through action. They're not always going to say the words, but they will be the one who fixes your car without being asked, who shows up with food when you're sick, who quietly pays a bill you're struggling with and never mentions it again. They love in the way they were raised to love, through presence, through practicality, through showing up. And if you're someone from a younger generation who needs verbal affirmation, you might spend years feeling unseen by someone who is actually pouring everything they have into loving you. That's not a flaw in them. It's a translation problem. And learning to read their language is one of the most worthwhile things you can do if you want to understand them. Let's be honest for a second about something harder. People who grew up in the 60s didn't always parent in a way that felt safe to their children. The same qualities that made them resilient, the practicality, the emotional restraint, the expectation that you toughen up, these things could also produce children who grew up feeling emotionally unseen, who weren't sure they had permission to be soft, who learned to hide weakness before they even knew what they were doing. This is one of the places where the generational wound gets passed down. Not through cruelty, through the only tools available. And a lot of the therapy that younger generations do today is in part the quiet unraveling of something that started in those 60s households. Not because those parents were bad, because they were doing exactly what had been done to them, and nobody had shown them another way. And yet, despite all of that, here is what I think is the most important thing to understand about people who grew up in the 60s. They survived. Not just the difficult childhoods, not just the chaos of the decade. They survived the long middle of life, the disappointments and the losses, and the slow erosion of certainty that comes with getting older. They survived watching the world change in ways they didn't always understand or choose. They survived becoming the older generation, the one the culture had stopped speaking to. And most of them did it with a kind of grace that doesn't announce itself. They just kept going. They just kept showing up. They just kept building and mending and holding together the things they loved. If you have someone in your life who grew up in the 60s, I want to say this to you directly. Learn to read them. Don't mistake their silence for indifference. Don't mistake their practicality for a lack of feeling. Don't assume that because they don't say the emotional things you need to hear, they don't feel them. Ask them about who they were when they were young. Ask them what they believed in. Ask them what the world felt like when it was still being remade. Because in that conversation, you will find something that I promise you can't find anywhere else. You'll find the story of what it means to have lived through a time when the world genuinely changed. and what it costs to be a human being inside that change. And if you are someone who grew up in the 60s, watching this, maybe trying to understand yourself a little better, or maybe just feeling seen for once without anyone trying to fix you, I want to say something to you too. The things that feel like your limitations, the difficulty with asking for help, the struggle to rest, the quiet grief of a world that moved past you without asking, those things are not proof that something went wrong with you. They're proof of what you carried. And you carried it for a very long time. You are allowed to put some of it down now. You are allowed to be seen, not just as the person who survived everything, but as the person who was, and still is, so much more than that. Tell me in the comments. Do you have someone in your life who grew up in the 60s? Or maybe you're from that generation yourself. What's the one thing you wish people understood about you that they almost never get right? I'd genuinely love to know. And if this video reached something in you, the next one is going to go even deeper. Because we're going to talk about the psychology of people who grew up being told they were too sensitive, and what that quietly does to a person over decades. Click it. You'll understand why you feel the way you do in ways nobody ever explained to you before.